I just approved it.
Thank you. All right, everyone, we're just going to get started in a minute here. Maybe to get started, if you guys want to drop in your names in the chat, tell us where you're calling in from and what you're most interested in learning about today, or what you're excited about learning about today. And if you want to share what organization you're affiliated with, you can go ahead and do that as well. So tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Well, to get started, I guess this is Les Brown. I have my daughter Rochelle with me now, but I work with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. We represent 4 tribes along that fish for salmon, steelhead, coho, and other fish along the Columbia River. There's 4 tribes involved: the Yakima, the Nez Perce, the Warm Springs, and the Umatilla tribes. And we catch probably close to a couple million pounds a year in fish.
Wow.
And so we have about 400 to 600 fishermen, and that varies. And so it's nothing I really write down, but that's the range. And they're trying to find, they've connected up, we've got more positive comments about local catch and the possibility of selling directly at farmers markets and direct to the public, and the steps of doing that, and hopefully a development grant that will help us. Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Wes. We're really, or Les, I called you Wes. Les, it's really good to see you on the call here. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Again, if you are just joining us, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourselves. You can drop your information in the chat. You can tell us your names, maybe the organization you're associated with, and what you're looking forward to gleaning from today's call. My name is Jordan. I am the coordinator for Local Catch Network, and on behalf of myself and the Local Catch Network Executive Committee, we're really glad that you all were able to join us today. The Local Catch Network is a community of practice that's made up of fishermen, organizations, researchers, and consumers across North America, committed to providing local, healthful, low impact, and sustainable seafood via community-supported fisheries and other direct marketing arrangements. The network is supported by an executive committee made up of fishermen, technical assistance providers, and tribal representatives from the US and Canada, and it has institutional support from North American Marine Alliance and the University of Maine. We will be recording today's session, and we'll be sharing that out to everybody who is attending today and everyone who signed up for the session as well. We encourage you all throughout the session to use the chat box to enter your questions. You can use the raise hand icon if you have questions as well. And we really want this session to be pretty interactive. So to give you guys a little bit of an idea of how we're going to be structured for today. It seems like many of you know that USDA recently announced that they have invested $92.2 million in grant funds for local and regional food producers and organizations. Much of this funding is available to seafood producers and organizations, and so that is why we're here to talk to you guys today. Through an existing cooperative agreement, AMS has partnered with 11 organizations, including Local Catch Network, to provide outreach and technical assistance with focus on socially disadvantaged, rural, and historically underrepresented grant applicants. Over the past couple months, Local Catch Network has been hosting a number of webinars and workshops and one-on-one technical assistance to share more information about grant opportunities available to seafood producers and harvesters. We've had a session about how to apply for funding and approaching grant writing. We have had a session most recently talking about the FMLFPP grants. So today we're going to be focusing on both of those with a Q&A session with grants management specialist Kim Harmon. And then today, we're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about a number of topics. So the topics that we're going to be hitting on are ones that will help you hopefully align your proposals with the USDA program mission. And we have a guest on the call today, Debra, who will be guiding us through that. So Debra spent more than 26 years at the USDA Agricultural Marketing Services, Transportation and Marketing Program. She retired in 2019. Over the course of her career, Debbie served in a variety of impressive roles, including agricultural economist, interim staff officer for the Federal State Marketing Improvement Program, team leader and chief of Farmers Market and Direct Farm Marketing Research Branch, and finally the deputy director of AMS Marketing Service Program, which focuses on local and regional food systems research, technical assistance, and outreach. So Debbie did recently retire, but she's still very heavily involved in this space and has, again, that 26 years of experience working within AMS in the USDA. She's now focusing more of her time on consulting and then staying very busy working on boards and et cetera that are involved in the food systems world still. So again, this session specifically is hopefully more of an interactive session compared to our last sessions. And we're going to have Debbie kind of go over the history of early legislation and why that matters when writing FMLFPP grants. Debbie's going to be leading us through identifying the priority areas that are outlined in the FMPP and LFPP programs. She's going to be helping us to interpret recommendations and grant RFAs, and then also discuss the difference between not only a really good application, but an important proposal or project ideas, and the difference between the two and how to align those with the grant evaluation criteria. So Debbie's going to kick us off and we're going to get started. She's going to spend maybe like 40 or so minutes kind of going over those topic areas that I've outlined. And then we are going to open it up to discussion and invite you all to share if you have specific proposal ideas, if you want to share that with the group, and kind of workshop together to identify ways to strengthen your proposals as you apply for funding this year or in future years. So really glad to have you all here today. I'm extremely excited to have Debbie on the call to be able to share some incredible information that will hopefully help connect some of the dots. You know, it's one thing from reading the RFA and like trying to glean from the RFA. It's another thing to really be able to analyze, like, what is that RFA asking me and how can I hit those points that are outlined on that RFA? So with all of that being said, if you just hopped on, please go ahead and put your name in the chat. If you want to tell us where you're calling in from or what organization you're affiliated with, go ahead and share that with us. Again, this is going to be hopefully a pretty interactive workshop, and we're going to reserve, again, about 45 minutes to an hour at the end of this session for us to have more of a conversational opportunity. So Debbie, with that, I'm going to pass it over to you to get us started.
I'm going to, well, thank you so much for that very generous and kind introduction. So I'm going to click here and hopefully we'll get this show on the roll. 1 second. And with luck, is it showing up, folks? Do I have, can you see the screen? Because now my screen is full and I can't see you guys. So is it visible?
I cannot see it.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if I need to share it again. Sorry for these technical difficulties, but we will go back. All right.
All right, here we go. It popped up.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, you know what? I think we can probably start right here. Welcome. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all for attending. And I hope that by the end of our session today, you have a better idea of how to, if you are putting together a grant, that you get a better sense of what the agency is likely to be looking for. This is not really so much an official stance of any agency as much as my very idiosyncratic opinion developed over a couple of decades after having both overseen the administration of a federal grant program and having been a reviewer for many within AMS, my former agency, Ag Marketing Service, and doing a number of rural development and National Institute of Food and Agriculture grants. So, what we're going to discuss today is we're going to just talk about what are some of the general considerations for writing a strong USDA AMS proposal. And I'm specifically mention AMS because I think it's very important to keep in mind that as we do proposals, we think about the mission area, the core mission. Forgive that sound. That is my glucose monitor going off, which is really annoying, but I can't mute myself. So, what are we going to do? So, anyhow, on the general considerations, I find that sometimes people have a tendency to think, I've got this great proposal and let me shop it around to different, agencies within USD or elsewhere and see if it gets, a good reception. Problem is that often the mission areas and what they are authorized to do are so distinct and they have such distinct flavors and priorities that often is sort of it's a waste of your time uh, because it's going to be obvious that some proposals really are not as suitable for some agencies as some others. So what I would say about AMS, and we'll learn more about this in a second, AMS is very producer focused. They're always concerned about how do producers benefit? How is this going to affect the change in producer income? How many producers are going to be affected? You'll see very different priorities, say, if you are applying for a NIFA grant, where often they're looking for educational change, or if you are applying for something with food and nutrition service, where they're going to look at changes in dietary or nutritional behavior. So that's, if there's anything I want you to take away from today's talk, it's really that. Think carefully and do a little homework about what the mission is, where is the grant legislation, where's it placed, and what are the primary values that it's connected to, because I think that will help you a lot in being competitive in competing for a grant. Um, so, as I just mentioned, we're going to talk about the authorizing legislation, how to make your grant stand out from the competition, looking at what are good versus important ideas, how you can illustrate the difference, and reading the tea leaves, looking at this year's solicitation and the RFA, and looking at what does it tell me about what I think the agent thinks is most important. So, with that, pardon the somewhat fine print here, but I know a number of you are often discouraged about applying for federal funds. You say, so competitive, how could I possibly have a chance? And I would say, it's true that it's competitive. I want to put the numbers here for you so that you had a sense of context. So last year, 30% of the Farmers Market Promotion Program grants were funded, of those that were submitted. And for a local food promotion program, 44% were funded. Um, Now, of course, this year we expect to have more funding. We don't know what that will mean in terms of the increased number, if there will be, of applications. But what I think is most important to keep in mind, and I can certainly vouch for this as a reviewer, just because there are a lot of submissions does not mean that any agencies reserves an overabundance of good ideas. There are a lot of stinkers. So, you're not competing necessarily with people that have often they're applying for funds, they're not doing the thoughtful analysis that hopefully you'll be doing when you're putting together your application. They're not carefully looking to make sure that they follow every instruction in the RFA. So don't talk yourself out of the opportunity. um, I have always found that if you've got a well conceived project and the scope of work is attainable, realistic, it's aligned with the program mission, then it almost always stands out. It certainly shares a decent chance of being funded. When we talk about competition here, we're saying, one of every 3 FMPP grants gets funded, one of, between 2 and 3 on the LFPP side. That is competitive, but those are not impossible odds. And I also think you need to keep in mind that those of you that are members of Local Catch already have advantages because you are representing producer interests, and that's intrinsically really important to AMS, and we'll see why. And fish and seafood topics have been historically underrepresented. For a long time, people didn't even realize that those were eligible entities that could apply under these grant programs. So I think there's going to be interest in awarding grants to solid projects that support these industries. Okay, so now we're going to get into some boring law. Forgive that, but I think it's important just to kind of go back in history and understand how some of these programs came to be and what are the principles that undergird the agency regulations. So, in the case of AMS, it's not the only piece of legislation that affects AMS's operation, but it is a key one. It's the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946. And what it asserts is that a sound, efficient, and privately operated system for distributing and marketing agricultural products is essential to a prosperous economy and is indispensable for the maintenance of full employment and to welfare, prosperity, and health of the nation. So, how do we respond to that? It says it is the intent of Congress to provide for continuous research. What is that research on? Marketing, handling, storage, processing, transportation, and distribution of agricultural products. Note, it's very, very technical. It's got a very logistics type of feel to it. And that is traditionally been AMS's stock and trade, whether it comes to implementing grade standards for commodities, setting standards for exports. This is typically a lot of the work and the user fee work that AMS does. So any kind of technical assistance that really helps us to achieve greater efficiency, greater clarity in the food marketing system is going to be of practical interest to agency people. What else was Congress, what was their intent here? To facilitate cooperation, and not just among other government agencies, but also with producers. So, industry organizations, others in the development, and they say effectuation of research and marketing programs to improve the distribution process. Now, of course, these have gotten interpreted over time in many different ways, but I think it's really important to just get a sense of what are some of the founding principles for these programs. So here is some specificity laid out by the 1946 Act about the type of activities that they like to see supported through this legislation. So it's research, market aids and services that help improve marketing methods and facilities, that reduce the cost of distribution. So when you say that, and also reduce the price spread between the producer and consumer. So consumer interests are really important here. The idea that may be a need for intermediation, but we don't want to see excessive intermediation. We want to see producers receive a reasonable share of the final price of agricultural products. And we want to make sure that we have an economical system that's also is fair to consumers and producers of products. There's a desire to see an improvement in dietary nutritional standards, to develop new and wider markets from agricultural products, both domestically and abroad. And there was a desire to make sure that all American farmers, fishermen, can make use of the marketing system so that food is distributed economically, profitably, and in an orderly manner. And what I think is so great about this is it has two underlying implications to me. One, it's suggesting that scale doesn't matter when it comes to who should be served by this legislation. Whether it's a small operation or a large operation, each deserves to have access to our domestic markets and our international markets, and all deserve an opportunity to be profitable. It also sort of implies that we want to reduce waste at the farm level and at the in the intermediation of farm products. We want to make sure that we reduce loss. So any kind of projects that are really centered on reducing loss that occurs through excessive handling or by streamlining the supply chain, all of those are likely to be of great interest as well. Okay, I know there's a lot of language. I promise you it's going to get clear in a minute. So finally, there was a secondary act that was passed in 1976 that was taking inspiration from the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946, but was actually sort of focusing on we need direct markets. Uh, it is the purpose of this act to promote the development and expansion of direct markets in agricultural commodities from farmers to consumers. To accomplish this objective, excuse me, the Secretary of Agriculture shall initiate and coordinate a program designed to promote and facilitate direct marketing from farmers to consumers for the mutual benefit of consumers and farmers. And what do we mean by mutual benefit? They tell us in Section 3, in a manner calculated to lower the cost and increase the quality of food that consumers receive while providing increased financial returns to the farmers. So, again, we're looking at programs that are serving the interest of producers. They have the side benefit of uh, potentially reducing excessive marketing costs by removing need for long distance transportation or excessive packaging, excessive advertising, which is seen as contributing to an economical supply chain. But again, producer viability, producer profitability, producer success, and an economical system that works to the benefit of all parties is what these regulations seem to be promoting and wanting to secure. Okay, well, I've already done a lot of kind of drilling down on this, but very quickly, what are the main takeaways? I think it's so important to recognize the enthusiastic embrace of working with private industry to address marketing and distribution issues. Just as the agency today, just as AMS, when they develop, say, marketing orders for something like a Vidalia onion, right? They are taking their lead from the industry about what the market needs are. They are not dictating. Yes, they are regulators, but in typically, and one of the reasons they're able to obtain industry user fees for many of their services is that they're typically taking information from industry, trying to respond to evolving industry needs, and then coming up with a technical solution that they are then funded to implement, much of it with user fee funds. So it is private industry driven, it is market driven. It is not a government solution. And so anything that you do to demonstrate that this is being driven by industry, that industry is dedicated to this, that industry is even making an investment in this in partnership with other community partners, I think bodes well for you. Um, we mentioned the full production. Again, I look at that as being scale neutral, which I think is a real advantage for smaller producers. Um, Making sure producers receive a fair share of consumer expenditure, is key. And again, supply chain logistics and what changes occur between the farm gate and the final buyer or even the wholesale buyer are really kind of the traditional emphasis of AMS programs. And although projects that take place in areas of concentrated poverty are given general priority in the RFA and have for a few years, um, this is not necessarily a food access program. This is not necessarily, or these are not, they don't have a special nutrition focus. That doesn't mean that those issues shouldn't be or can't be incorporated, but you may not want to lead with that as your primary objective. Um, so I kind of took that information and I said, well, what does that mean to me? And I thought, well, what does it mean to embrace partnership with producers and private industry? And I thought, well, in terms of shaping a proposal, perhaps it's important then that as you put your proposal together, you illustrate in your narrative how your project was shaped by individuals with deep industry knowledge and expertise, that you make the effort to substantiate their knowledge and expertise in the application. I mean, you can do that just in terms of writing about their track record, including the resume or CV in the application, in the appendix. How is their experience relevant? How is the experience of the group? Has the group that's going to be the project team worked together before? What have they accomplished? What elements in your grant proposal indicate that your project is well grounded in reality? Who are you working with? What have they been doing that's relevant in the past? And how are you reflecting that the participants in the project are very familiar with industry trends and practices? And because of that, they've decided to explore this particular um, innovation, new practice, expansion, what have you. How is that better than available alternatives? How are you recommending a solution to an existing problem, existing market problem? Will industry practitioners be the primary beneficiaries of your planning project? I should say planning or implementation. How many practitioners will benefit overall? How will you assess their accomplishments? How will you measure them? We'll talk about that later, about the logic model. And how will you document the lessons learned through your project so that they can be eventually shared with other audiences? And what's going to be replicable about what you've done that's going to be meaningful to other communities? Okay. On the issue of shortening supply chains and increasing market access, so I think it'd be interesting to consider whether or not your project could illustrate some of the desired goals that are talked about in the authorizing legislation. So, are producers going to be able to receive a greater share of the final retail price or greater cash flow than they currently receive from existing marketing channels? Would your project lead to greater efficiency in distribution, or would it reduce marketing costs? Would it allow producers to sell a greater amount of product than before? Or would it create new market opportunities for less desirable items, for seconds or equivalent? Would it reduce product loss in the supply chain? So I just throw those out. I mean, those are certainly not inclusive, but I just throw those out as ideas of what are you trying to test and how does that fit in with the ethos of what we see in the agency policy. Okay, so Jordan mentioned before at the start of this the idea of good versus important ideas, and I would say many of us think we have a great idea, but how do we convince reviewers to agree with our assessment that we have a great idea? And so I thought about the question of what makes a project not just good on this but important. And so one question I ask is, would your project make a significant contribution to the current body of knowledge on the subject that you're studying? Is it just replicating a model that's been tested elsewhere, or is it really novel Are there aspects of it that are unprecedented? I mean, I think it's hard to do something that's completely original, but what are the maybe aspects of this that really, because of the setting, situation, people involved, that make it somewhat uh, different and really expand knowledge and awareness in new ways? Um, Also, how would your project empower producers to become more successful entrepreneurs? So, what would they take away from your planned intervention? I mean, would they have a greater skill set? Would they be more technically skilled? Would they have greater exposure to potential business partners or customers? Would they have the increased ability to deliver products to spec? Something else? So, what are you leaving them with? What is the value add? What data do you plan to collect before and after your activity that would shed light on how your intervention made a difference in their ability to take advantage of business opportunities? How likely is it that the lessons you learn and the people that you work with learn for your project are valuable and adaptable to other regions, other communities, other like minded groups of industry practitioners? How can you demonstrate that? By using, maybe by citing relevant statistics in your narrative, talking about other situations. Um, Again, how do you intend to document the results of your project so that it can eventually be publicized and shared with a wide audience? So thinking beyond what's required in reporting requirements and how what you plan to do to publicize um, your outcomes, and how might, excuse me, and how might the activities that you initiated using grant funding be perpetuated after funding ends? Do you have plans for that? And what are your plans? And how realistic are they? So I think some of those considerations are, which really relate to impact, lasting impact and legacy, are some of the issues that distinguish what we might consider a good idea and one that benefits from a particular group over an important idea that might have broader implications. So, um, I know you probably know some of this already. Um, it's today, this year's RFA is quite confusing because of the way that funding is going to be allocated. And so I thought it would just be helpful to sort of reiterate a bit what the sources of appropriation are and what the requirements are for dispersing those funds. So there are three basic areas of appropriation. There's annual appropriation. There are appropriation dictated by Congress for the programs via the latest Farm Bill, which was signed in December 2018. And there were those that were adopted earlier this year in accordance with the USDA's Pandemic Assistance from Producers Initiative. And this was launched in March to address perceived shortfalls and disparities and how COVID-related assistance was distributed under the previous administration. It's this latter pot of funds that has a specific focus on strengthening outreach to underserved groups and communities and small and medium-sized agricultural operations. And that's the reason that Jordan, for example, on Local Catch, is working on tailored outreach to this community through a cooperative research agreement with my old agency that is funded by some of these monies. Um, so bottom line, USDA AMS has the authority this year to award up to 38.5 million to each FMPP and LFPP in 2021, and that's up from 13.5 million for each program last year. So obviously, quite a bit. Some of it, as we'll mention in a second, may not be dispersed this year, but 22.5 million of it is authorized in the 2018 Farm Bill. 47 million was provided as emergency funding through this year's COVID-related assistance, and nearly $7.5 million through annual appropriations. So why does this matter? Partly it matters because if you want to be considered for all of the pots of funding that are being dispersed, you ought to plan for a 25% match in your proposal. Because the projects with 10% match, and that can be cash or in kind, so it gives you some wiggle room. But if you're just doing a 10% match, it's only eligible to be considered for the portion of funding that originated from the pandemic assistance. As far as what AMS is required to spend, they are required to spend its annual appropriation. So 7.4 million, 3.8 million for each grant program in 2021. They expect to spend the majority of their pandemic-related funding, which would be 23.5 million for each program, which is considerably up from under 14 million for each last year. But they may decide to hold back some of the 22.5 million in Farm Bill funding until next year if they are not completely satisfied with the quality of projects submitted. So this is just to give you sort of a basic idea of what one can expect in this year's confusing time, as best as I was able to figure it out. So I think I just went backwards. Okay. Oh, okay. Also to be aware, as a result of the pandemic assistance funding, the new infusion of funding, the caps on different grants have been increased pretty considerably, so it's important to know what your limitations are. I would not use a budget that seems artificially high. Your reviewers will notice. So it should be cost effective as you figure out your scope of work, but this may give you a little more room to develop the kind of project you want with the kind of capacity you need. So please note those changes, that a capacity building grant under FMPP can be up to $500,000, 750K in the case of FMPP community development training and TA grants, the equivalent of an implementation grant. For LFPP, planning grants are increased to 200K, and on implementation grants, 150K. Okay, moving to sort of the latter part of my presentation here, I thought it would be useful to review quickly what are some of the priorities that are being spelled out in the request for applications and related to the pandemic funding. And the top three are true whether or not we're talking farmers market promotion program or local food promotion program. So hiring experts for technical assistance to implement a local or regional transportation system to assist in COVID response and recovery efforts. Interesting. Development of strategies to partner with other organizations affected by the pandemic. I think some of that emerged because of many of the success stories we saw during the pandemic, where you saw much more partnering of, say, food distribution organizations, food hubs, supplier networks with organizations offering food assistance, often community-based. So I think looking at novel partnerships is something that they're trying to stress here. Developing tools, techniques, or practices that can be rapidly adopted, including those that provide direct financial support to market networks to assist in COVID response and recovery efforts. And when we say COVID response and recovery, let's think about, too, what we've learned from COVID and how are we going to prepare for that in the future. So think about activities that really are aimed at trying to build the resilience of communities. How are they building up inventories? How are they coming up with backup ways of doing things if they in the event that there's major disruption in the food system. I think those would all be of great interest to reviewers. For the local food promotion program, two of the specific activities cited were developing or expanding food incubator programs or mid-tier value chains to assist in COVID response and recovery efforts. Certainly on food incubator programs, many of this related to value-added production and processing. Um, I think that would include certainly, different ways of preparing product, freezing product. Um, could include, use of equipment. Uh, so uh, the other one, cultivating new wholesale market channels through an online portal. Again, this seems to me looking at the ways in which being able to do virtual transactions really emerged as very important, really essential during the pandemic. And now that we're looking at some of these things in the back, retrospectively, what is the balance that we're trying to create between relying virtually and benefiting from those efficiencies that come with a virtual platform while restoring some of the face-to-face interaction and relationship building that we were accustomed to in direct marketing. So I think there's probably a lot of room for experimentation and observation there. Um, Going back a little bit and looking at what Congress intended in 2018, you'll see a lot of similar emphases to what I think exists in the authorizing legislation for these programs in earlier times. So we see an emphasis on connecting and cultivating regional food economy through public-private partnership again. We also see new emphasis on job creation, and certainly the agencies have been very interested in, and I don't know if I saw it as an explicit outcome this year, but it has existed in past years, but measuring the impact on jobs, job creation, and job opportunities that open up as the result of project implementation. It also could mean changes in income. Um, it facilitates regional food supply chain coordination, not just local. We don't have at USDA a very good definition of local. Frankly, I think this is a good thing. There's an idea that communities and food sheds ought to define that for themselves, depending on what trade relations are like, what a trade area looks like, and use that as the boundary. But I think there's an interest in seeing, you know, what an expansion of local food supply chains look like and how that can be sustained and what needs to be involved. Again, we see an emphasis on reducing farm food waste, responding to changing technological needs in direct to consumer marketing, and we certainly saw that take on probably new vigor during the pandemic era when we really had almost no other way to operate. And somewhat related to this, making changes and upgrades to practices and equipment to improve food safety and permit expansion of food certification. So, in an era where consumers are extremely concerned about safety of product and their awareness has become much greater of safety issues, how are we responding to uh, consumer concerns and buyer concerns along the way? Okay, this comes straight from the RFA. What I tried to do was take the weighted criteria that the reviewers are going to use and pull out what I thought were the most important aspects of it. Under alignment, so the first thing I would say is that the three um, topics here are the ones that receive the heaviest weight in the review process. So this accounts for 75 out of 100 points. Alignment and intent is 25 points. Technical merit is 25 points. And expertise and partners is 25 points. Alignment and intent. I mean, you can go back to the RFA and you can read the exact language, but what I took it to mean was and we talked about this before, identifying the numbers of participants or likely participants in the project, how they will benefit, how will they actively be engaged in the project, and why the geographic area you're operating in is an appropriate choice. Keep in mind that as the reviewers, well, I shouldn't say reviewers, once the review is by the peer reviewers, the independent peer reviewers, is completed, the staff will be looking at it, and they and certainly will geography will enter in a little bit in terms of the fact that they want to have a diverse geographic areas and diverse selection of uh, farm food and farm products represented. Uh-oh, something just happened. Can you hear me, guys? Did I
We
just
can
you just
we can hear you, but we can't see you, but we can still see the PowerPoint.
I don't know why they did that. Let's see if this works.
Oh, you're back.
All right. I have a crazy computer. What can I tell you? All right. All right. Technical merit. So again, talked about this before. A realistic work plan schedule. Can you get things done on time? Do you have the right kind of resources to get it done on time? Do you have the number of people? Are you writing down how much time they're going to be spending on particular tasks? Please follow the forms in the format that's listed in the RFA. They want as much specificity as possible. They want letters of commitment and following a specific format. Um, you can read all that, but basically, the reviewers will be looking to see, um, does the work plan make sense? Is it achievable? Is it the right kind of people associated? Are there the right kind of people associated with the project to carry out the tasks that are identified? And does it build on a foundation of previous similar work? If that's the case, if so, how is that the case? Expertise in partners. I noticed the reference to strong, diverse, effective project team. I saw that as meaning both experienced and multidisciplinary, that you have people representing different perspectives, different points of view, different points of access, and working together, um, they can help, you can complement each other's uh, knowledge base and skill sets. A demonstrated commitment among those in the project team to active participation and a good plan for internal communication. How are they going to communicate regularly? How is that being overseen? Are you including historically underserved entities? If so, how so? And please showcase that in your proposal. And a demonstrated commitment to continuing the project, or at least the collaborations that have been developed through the project, beyond the grant performance period. All right, now what's happening here? Come on. What's happening here? All of a sudden, there we go. Achievability. So these are lesser, but just to kind of wrap up this section, what stands out? So we talked about achievability. The achievability here is really meaning how well have you put together your list of outcome indicators, how your interventions are going to lead to particular outcomes, what are the factors that could both either contribute to the attainment of your objectives or interfere with the attainment of those objectives, and what are your action steps for addressing factors that could hamper your progress in the project. Fiscal plan and resources, that the budget is consistent with the work plan, that you provide evidence, and yes, there is a form, that critical resources infrastructure needed for the completion of the project are in place, and evidence that contributions of non-federal cash or in-kind resources are currently available. Again, document, document, document. Attention to detail matters. Uh, these are forms of the templates that are provided in the RFA. I strongly recommend using them. They were going to point out exactly what types of information the reviewers are expected to look at and what the staff will be looking for in reviewing your applications. The suggested match verification, the suggested partner organization letter, which is a letter of commitment, and suggested evidence of critical resources infrastructure. And this is basically to document, to confirm that the land, the structures, the other critical resources are in place in working condition at the time that the application is submitted. I leave this with you, and I assume, Jordan, you're going to make this available to people online or.
Yes, definitely.
So, this is from NIFA, from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. It is their generic model of what a logic model should look like. It starts with situation, description of challenge or opportunity, what the group is investing, faculty, staff, time, knowledge, collection of stakeholder opinions, etc., activities, outputs, but most important is outcomes. So the difference between output and outcome, an output could be a deliverable, could be a report. The outcome is what change, what shift happens in people's knowledge, in their actions, or the conditions in which they live as a result of your activities and of your deliverables. And that's among the most important things that you're going to need to put into your proposal, is a sense that you are not just looking at producing outcomes, i.e., I got X number of people to attend this webinar, I got X number of people to order a report, but they use the information that we gave them and they made these changes, and we can measure those changes, whether it's increase in knowledge or receiving some kind of, I don't know, achieving some type of milestone, increasing their sales. Um, so hopefully you'll find that useful as a reference piece. And that's all I've got for now. And I see there's a lot of questions I haven't looked at yet, so let's look at them. And thank you all. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Sure.
I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, or if you could stop sharing your screen, that'd be great.
Done.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for providing all of that amazing background. We had a couple questions that came in while you were chatting and teaching us along the way. Like I said, it looks like we have a little over 30 minutes for questions and to really dive in. If you all want to share, again, specific proposal ideas or anything that you feel comfortable sharing with the group in kind of relation to what Debbie went over. Hopefully Debbie's presentation and what she shared will be helpful in thinking about how can I take some of these pieces and incorporate them into my proposal or application. Like I said, we will be sharing the recording from today's session as well as Debbie's PowerPoint. If you have questions to start off with, please go ahead and start dropping them in the chat. I know we have one question that is probably at the top of mind for a lot of people on this call. And then also, again, if you want to just use a raise hand icon to speak out, please do. But we'll just start off with Toge's question. So let's see, Toge is in Maine. She does scallops and she might aggregate some additional seafood. Maybe she would be interested in speaking up. But there is, this question comes up a lot. So the way that the LFPP and the FMPP seems to be outlined is that focus on the local and regional food systems, right? So the way that USDA technically defines local and regional food systems is a 400-mile radius. So they put together some verbiage on what that means. So the definition of local or regional food business enterprise is an organization or business entity that functions as an intermediary between producers, so that could be farmers or growers or fishermen, and buyers carrying out one or more of the following local or regional food supply chain activities, including aggregating, storing, processing, and or distribution of locally or regionally produced food products. So again, USDA defines local or regional food as having traveled less than 400 miles from the origin of the product. And with seafood in particular, again, this question has been coming a lot. So AMS has framed it as 400 miles from where that seafood has been landed, so the port that it comes into. So yeah, I think there's some gray area there, and it really depends on your specific project. So for instance, and Debbie, I would love for you to chime in as
Sure.
well. But
I was looking at Toad's question. I can go ahead and do that if you like.
sure,
Toad.
yeah, that
I
would be great.
actually, hi Toad. Is that Toad is the way you pronounce your first name? I just want to make sure I get that right. Okay. Um, I like the way you mentioned it, which is I'm wondering if I need to tweak my proposal to highlight the percentage of customers within 400 miles, or if that's not necessary. I would. I would tweak it. Because I think if you can demonstrate it, the thing is, the only reference we have to local regional in terms of definition, USDA, is there's like one piece that RD has, which is a maximum of 400 miles, and I understand the rationale for doing that. I also understand the limitations of that. But I think if you can demonstrate that you generate a good portion, or probably the majority, even if just a bare majority of your sales within 400 miles from where your product lands, as Jordan says, then I think that you qualify to fit within the framework of the program as it's implemented. Go ahead.
So, I guess the second part of my question would be, so, and definitely I would say 60% of my sales are within 400 miles. So I would qualify there, and my goal really, I've been thinking about doing this for a while, but I haven't had the money. So this is actually a great opportunity if I could just,
Sure.
25% of it, to add some bells and whistles to my website to make it easier to integrate text messaging when things are available. So I have some things that I want to do. I'm wondering if it would strengthen my proposal or dilute it to say, and in addition, I would like to hold some in-person pickup events.
I think that would enhance it.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
Okay, that's an easy, quick answer. Okay, so
I mean, this is like I say, just my opinion. Because why not? I mean, why not? I mean, one, you need to do it now because you weren't able to do it recently. I mean, it makes sense. You've got your rationale for doing it, so you just make the case. Why do you think that's useful? Why do you think that will help grow your business or business of your associates? And I think it's important. This really has to be for multiple producers, but I'm sure you're aware of that because you cannot be a single producer. But I see no problem with that. I just think that's you make your case, and how are you going to test that? I think is really the important question to ask. So, what's going to be the impact of the in-person events, and how can you even do an assessment, maybe kind of informally, but sort of before and after, maybe consumer awareness of different kinds of product or what you're demonstrating. Is there something that they can opt in and answer something, or just think through what is it that you hope to achieve and that you can measure in terms of traffic to your site. Um, you know, think about those indicators. That's what I would do. Great. All right. I see one new message.
Let's see. Les asked what the average size of these grants are. So I will
that is a good question.
Drop into the chat. So there are different tracks for an FMPP and an LFPP, for both FMPP and LFPP programs. So when you are applying, you essentially are checking off one of these tracks. So for FMPP specifically, there's a capacity building so that you can apply between $50,000 to $500,000 of funding. And that's a 36-month grant period. And then there's a community development training and technical assistance track. And you can apply for up to $750,000 for that one. And those so those have differing amounts of funds that you can apply for. And then I will have to pull up the LFPP here and drop it in the chat for you as well. So that is something to consider when you are working on your application, is what track does my project fall into? Because you will have to decide when you're applying, where that fits best.
And one thing I would just tell us, it's hard to give you good averages because the numbers have changed so much. It used to be that you had $100,000 cap. I mean, for many on FMPP funds, and you had a much smaller funding pool. So it used to be that I would tell you 50,000, but that's no longer true. So in I don't know anymore, and I'm not sure what kind of good data we have, because between the difference in this year's PUD and the possible funding decisions, there was also a deliberate decision that made 3-4 years ago to raise it so that the FMPP was managing so many grants and so many small grants, as small as 5,000, that it was beyond the administrative capacity of the office to deal with it. So we've just seen a lot of changes over time. Um, they are not as generous as you would say, like a NIFA grant, which is, intense research grant. It's usually, a lot of them go for either 750,000 over 18 months to 2 years. Um, but they are better than they used to be, and I think there's a lot of flexibility in how you can use the money. You cannot pay for construction costs. You can't pay for rehabilitating a building. We can't purchase land with it. I mean, there's some limitations, all of which are laid out, but within what is allowable, I mean, and the eligible entities are very, very vast. For both LFPP and FMPP. For those who don't know, most of you probably do know, the main distinction that the agency makes between FMPP, LFPP in terms of project eligibility side is they look to the purely direct to consumer for FMPP grants, and those that involve some level of intermediation or aggregation for the LFPP grants. That's the major distinction. Congress makes no such distinction. It's one program, but the agency implements it is two strands of one program.
And I think this kind of relates to something Debbie mentioned earlier about when you're applying for funding, you have to show the reviewers that there's justification for asking for that funding. So not only do you need to make sure that the activities that you're proposing are allowable. So again, are they eligible to receive funding for specific areas? Like, so for instance, like Debbie said, you can't purchase land, but you could lease land. So make sure you are understanding what is allowable and what is not allowable. And then secondly, make sure that you have shown that you've done the research in terms of like how much the activities in this project are going to cost. So that could include maybe a portion of someone's salary that's going to be paid for in order to complete a certain activity or an objective that you've laid out in your proposal, or if it's going to include contracting like a website developer, and maybe you've already had conversations and gotten quotes for that, or if it is, I know some things qualify, so like maybe it's pop-up tents for a farmer's market or something like that. Make sure that you've shown that you've done that research and that those costs are not exorbitant, that they are reflective of like what those costs would actually be.
I couldn't agree more. That's exactly right. And if you need to, I mean, in terms of if you don't know what the costs are of something, or say you don't know what someone's wage rate's going to be, I mean, you could really look up the Department of Labor and like look at an average regional cost of certain types of, work activity, and plug that in and say, this is our estimate, as a proxy. But the level of detail you provide, it only works to your advantage. It just shows you've done your homework, and it shows that you're trying to root in reality, and you're not trying to be, artificially inflate the price of what things are actually going to be. And you see, we have a question.
Yes.
Hey, you want to read it?
Yeah, or unless Jennifer, and if you want to speak up, if not, I will call it out. I'll give her a second here. Okay, I will just go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead and read it out. So she has a question about the LFPP. She sees that the cleaning is not an eligible expense, but it is one portion of their program. Will that disqualify their activities, even though there are multiple other benefits that were mentioned in this presentation, including it being industry driven by commercial fishermen, bycatch/food waste reduction, creating new markets for fishermen to sell more of their catch, providing valuable data for fisheries management plans, etc.
Wow, that is a great question. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you a qualified answer. I did not realize, I mean, I imagine that where it says gleaning is not an eligible expense, it's basically um, it just says gleaning is not an eligible expense in the budget. It doesn't, and I need to check, and I don't know, Jordan, if you can check quickly to see where gleaning is referenced in the RFA, because I need to look at that to answer the
Yes.
question. But yeah, I mean, look at all the justification you made. For one, this is just one portion of what you're doing. I mean, it sounds like you have some, you are trying to be environmentally astute on many levels, and gleaning is just one portion of it. I mean, hey, the USDA farmers market does gleaning. I mean, they certainly, there are programs at USDA that support gleaning. They certainly approve it and support it as a philosophy. And, you know, perhaps this is related to the fact that they say at USDA, usually gleaning they do in lieu of charging fees for participants on the farmers market. The farmers will glean and the donations go to DC Central Kitchen. Maybe they're just saying something, and I just need to clarify this in relation to the costs involved in gleaning. I would probably just not try to cost out the expenses involved for gleaning to the grant as much as possible. It sounds like, but I see there's no reason not to talk about it as a waste recovery issue and a positive environmental issue. And yeah, I mean, the data. I mean, you've got great justification here, all of which,
Yeah.
as a reviewer, I'd be curious to read. So
Yeah, it's one of the it's a program that we started a couple of years ago, and it was a partnership between the commercial fishing industry. And I know you said food access is not really the focus of this program,
right,
but food processors and food banks as a way
yes,
of reducing bycatch.
absolutely.
The commercial fishermen came up with that as a way to utilize non-regulated species that were coming up as bycatch.
Right.
Getting it to processors who are willing to process it as a reduced fee and deliver it to food banks to help people get nutritional, food that is not typically coming to food banks. But the benefits are more than just food access, because
clearly.
the non-regulated species that are bycatch, that data is not going to NOAA because it's not going to market. So this is giving them information that they're not currently having. Also, if this fish can be, more people can be exposed to these species,
right,
it could create a market where,
right,
fishermen can be selling this product. If people become more familiar with it, it could take pressure off of more high, more species that have more pressure on them, like salmon and tuna and things like that. So it could create a larger market. They could sell more of the fish that they are catching that they're not able to sell right now because there is no market for it. And it does bring them more in line with the Magnuson-Stevenson's Act with reducing bycatch.
Listen, just here's my suggestion. Don't call it gleaning.
Mm-hmm.
Call it bycatch.
Same thing. So Jennifer, are you guys?
It is bycatch, but our nonprofit name is America's Gleaned Seafoods, so that's our problem.
It doesn't
Are
matter.
you?
Don't call
Jennifer?
it gleaning in the proposal, because they're not going to understand it as gleaning.
Are you paying?
More like seconds. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Jennifer. Are you paying for the bycatch? Are you paying fishermen for that?
No, we are not.
Okay.
They're receiving no tax incentive, no payment. The only thing, the dock masters are donating the wharfage. They're not charging the fishermen for bringing it on, to docks. The docks are donating this, they're managing the seafood gleaning boxes for free. The ice, the icing of that, and they are keeping the documentation for the traceability and all of that. And they are recording what goes to market, and we're recording to NOAA what is gleaned.
And is all of the gleaned or like bycatch product then donated to food banks?
Yeah, the only expense is the processing.
Okay. Okay. I think, Debbie, and maybe you can speak to this.
Sure.
I don't want to lead you astray, but a portion of the specific FMPP and the LFPP grants is to be able to increase sales of local producers as well. And so I'm curious, Debbie, what your thoughts are if, like Jennifer, like I agree with you, all of those activities are like so important and necessary, but in terms of like these specific grants, Debbie, do you think?
I think it would be a shame if a grant like a proposal like this were not given serious consideration. Okay, by FMPP or LFPP, just depending on the channels. It sounds like it because it's going to an institution. It's somebody directed to. I probably do it LFPP. I know
The challenge is how to frame it.
how to frame it. Honestly, I just don't even want them to think of the word gleaning because their idea of gleaning is like going to be so completely. They've never thought about anything you've talked about already. Okay, when they think gleaning, they're not thinking what you're saying, and it would be terrible for that sort of interpretation of or misinterpretation of guideline to hamper your ability to compete successfully for funds that I think are intended to support exactly the kind of activity you're doing, which has the multiple benefits of not just potentially increasing sales, it's also a COVID response, how to work with food banks and to get protein into food banks, and new community partnerships, and reducing waste.
Yes, but I don't know if they will. You said don't lead with food access, which is.
No, well, I would say don't. Well, but it's because you're tying it into it's a community partnership to create new market opportunities for locally caught product. I don't, and I see that as more of kind of a wholesale institutional sales issue. Okay, even if it's donated, but there's I guess that's one question we have to talk about is, how is this contributing, or how do the fishermen that participate see it as a contributing to their bottom line?
Right.
That's important, and that would be important to emphasize. But I think it hits on so many of the topics that I imagine that staff and people, that I mean, that Congress people that adopted legislation would like to see. Um, I, I just think I would if you're going to say gleaning, I think that you need to do is up front define it for that purpose, and what we mean by gleaning is state.
Right.
Because
I don't want to dominate everyone's time, but I appreciate your input and any help that anyone could offer on how to frame this correctly.
Right.
I would appreciate, whether offline or not.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, we should touch base. So I'll leave contact information too, so we can follow up.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So we have another question. And Debbie, is there any way you could speak to retrofitting an existing structure? An example might be a food truck or a shipping container into like potentially like a processing facility. And then on top of that, what do you, and I'm sorry to ask you this, and if we need to go to somebody else to ask the question, that's totally cool. But from your experience or what you remember, what parts of those activities are maybe eligible for funding as well?
So, what feasibility study probably is funded. It probably can be funded. So if they were to work with an architect or something and to figure out, because if this is a planning grant, and to figure out if it's feasible and the fees associated with hiring personnel to do a study, do the measurements, and cost it out, I believe that would be covered. It's literally the cost of hiring people to do construction or the cost of land. Also, if it's a matter of renting equipment, even renting to buy, that is often a legitimate expense in these. But again, we get back to that whole, you know, that new form that they have about critical infrastructure. But certainly there's precedent for, at least I know, LFPP for purchasing refrigerated trucks, for purchasing freezers. But it's, you know, again, it's is that the primary use of the grant money? Is it a supplemental use that's part of a broader project, which also has a lot of labor involved and, you know, various phases? Um, so it's some of it's contextual. Um, but the only hard and fast rules as I interpret them, and I am not a lawyer and I'm not on staff, but are really against land, the cost of rehab, the cost of purchasing buildings. Um, Other things are more, there's more wiggle room. And there's a
Yeah.
list of I mean, we can go through, Jordan, if you want, the list of prohibited expenses that are in the RFAs, which I did not list out.
Yeah, I would say so that I think maybe that is the starting point, is saying, you know, how important it is to review that RFA, and so much of that information is in the RFA. And again, that RFA is pretty big and can be somewhat complex, but I think USDA has tried to do a good job at providing like a table of contents and laying out you know, what qualifies as eligible activities or expenses. Yeah, we can kind of get into the nitty gritty offline as well. So
one other thing I'd mention is that my old agency now has 2 architects on staff that provide free architectural assistance to people who are looking to rehab uh, food market facilities, primarily wholesale marketing facilities. And what I mean by wholesale is that anything that isn't final retail. Um, so, you know, it could be farmers markets, it could be food hubs and the like. And so there's the senior and junior architect. And yes, you know, there's a lot of demand for their services, but often they will work with the architects on the ground to provide their own specialized knowledge of food marketing facilities to help communities make those decisions. So I say this partly to mention that some resources are available at no cost from government. Also, I say it to note that it kind of underscores the support that exists for looking to repurpose infrastructure. So I don't think we should look at these funding arms as prohibiting. I mean, in many ways, I think they want to support, you know, a careful repurposing of existing physical infrastructure, but they are prohibited by Congress and probably by other precedent from funding certain kinds of activity. And I suspect a lot of that had to do with trying to prevent speculative activity at first. Thank you for putting the no-cost architectural support link up.
yeah, I think this is honestly like such a cool component of AMS's work. And I know that there have been some grant awardees who have used this as part of their grant. And again, this is a free service. And I think right now AMS is doing a lot of virtual consultations, but sometimes I think they will also visit on site. So I know
they have in the past, yes.
For example, there's a seafood and farmers market in Louisiana who use these services to build out, I believe it was like a processing / like kitchen. And so I know that they used AMS's architectural support to build out plans for that, to better understand like ergonomics wise and like I guess probably like taking into consideration like water lines and like all of that of how to go about setting up those commissary type kitchens. So this is a really, really cool program. And yeah, if you need assistance, this is one way to go. I think, Debbie, maybe we have a couple more minutes. So if anyone has any more questions, please drop them in or raise your hand. But I'm curious to know, Debbie, do you know if, so for instance, if like someone were to put like a hand washing station or something like that into their processing storage container unit, is that potentially an allowable expense? Because I'm thinking of it as more of like, it's kind of like a food safety.
I do too. That's how I would look at it. I mean, to me, that's not, that's making, I mean, it's making a physical improvement, but you're not like renovating a building, it's right. I would look at that as a food safety related issue. And again, though, I mean, I think in general, I think it's best to look at AMS grants as a way of receiving money for labor that you couldn't necessarily get otherwise, rather than thinking of AMS as the way to pick up expenses for equipment and infrastructure. That doesn't mean that there aren't allowable equipment and infrastructure expenses, but I think that you don't have as positive a chance of competing successfully for a grant if you only apply for equipment and infrastructure. I think they want to see a more holistic approach, and something where it's very intentional, and it's about doing the research and analysis of here's the intervention we're going to do, we're going to test it, we're going to see how it works, and we're going to give you some collected information about changes in behavior or changes in conditions that resulted. That's what's really important, and that's why I think there's such a de-emphasis on funding for specific physical upgrades. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think this is another question that kind of ties, two questions that kind of tie into that. So, so one, production is raising the animal / catching the fish, expenses not covered. And then processing is making the product. So that could potentially cover packaging, labels, and shelves. Is there a limitation for equipment leasing?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of. Again, it's a balancing act. If you went in and you just put together a proposal, and it was all about, I need money for labeling and packaging, and it wasn't oriented towards how am I going to look at this, the difference that it made to members of, the producer members of my business, to, our overall cost structure, to, so what analysis is accompanying this? That's what I'd want to know. If there's no plan of work that's a little more holistic or systems based, then I think that does not make for a particularly strong proposal. So I think, again, let's go back to that good versus important. Yeah, you need this, okay, but is this the right avenue? Because does the agency really, what is going to make the agency care about the improvement that you made? They're going to care because they're going to see that improvement leads to other outcomes. And those outcomes pertain to the success of a producer in a community, the money that circulates within a community, let's say. That's what they care about. So you need to set it up so that you're going to extract information from people and report it back in a way that makes that case. Optimally, that's what you want to do.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. You said it so well, Debbie. I feel like if you can justify, and again, USDA is asking for you to outline 3 to 4 objectives in your proposal. So if you can tie again and justify those expenses to those objectives, and like how purchasing or how leasing equipment, or how purchasing tables, or how you know, some of that funding could go towards like online website development or something like that. How do those activities help you meet those objectives? And so those objectives, again, to Debbie's point, is like, what are the important outcomes of those objectives that align with what the USDA is essentially asking for, or like in part of their mission. So
I know I mean, and this is not easy, and this is a, you know, sort of, as I was going through the presentation, I'm like, you know, I sort of hate like having to burden everybody with all this information, all this detail. I mean, it is, this just is the nature of the beast, and it is a beast. I think it's a beast that you can defeat. I think it's a beast you can manage, but it's a beast, and there are lots of complicated reasons why that is. Because we have to go through so much. I still say we. I know I've been retired for over 2 years, but hey, uh, whether the USC people go through so much to have to justify to Congress the decisions they make and justify to senior leadership the decisions they make, and it's all about documentation. So in a way, that gets attached to everything that they administer. Um, but uh, but ultimately it's good for everybody. It's a transparent process. Everybody learns so much from this engagement, and it helps you think outside the box. You know, and think about, um, you know, what is it that it helps you think, what is it that I'm really trying to learn from this? I hypothesize that if I buy X, if I install X, it's going to lead to this outcome. But that's an experiment, it's a test. So just think about all of this as setting up a scientific experiment. What are you trying to set up in your lab, your local lab? And what are you trying to prove? And how you're making that case, and how are you going, what kind of information you're going to collect that's going to, you know, provide the proof that's necessary that your hypothesis was correct. And even if it was incorrect, we are going to learn valuable lessons from it. So I don't know how else to frame it, but that's the best analogy I can come up with.
yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, Debbie. So we are coming up on time. I don't know if you guys are okay with squeezing in one more question. If you do have to hop off just really quickly, we are having people sign up for one-on-one technical assistance. I dropped that link in the chat, or you can email us at Local Catch. And then I'll be sending out that information in the email as well, with the recording link and then this PowerPoint that Debbie put together. So if you have to hop off, go ahead. But I think
I'll just do this last
other
quickly.
Deb,
I don't have a whole lot on it, but let's
yeah.
talk about, hi, Deborah. Nice name, nice first name you have there. Anyhow, I don't think that there's any barrier to doing this. I don't think I think what you want to do, once again, is explain, like, we're going to do this because we think it's our one attempt to get more people involved, and once they see that it's beneficial, then they will continue to want to participate in this market channel. So I think it's really a matter of making the case. I don't see any intrinsic barrier to doing it. I think, again, you got to note that it's not something you're going to do repeatedly over time, or you'd have to have some kind of external funding source for it. You wouldn't want to have funding and then have to drop it. And then, you have to just put it in context and recognize that, what you're testing, and that it's for a limited time, and you're going to see if people think it's worth their while to engage. But yeah. I would work it into something a little bigger than just getting the money to cover the permits and insurance. But again, so what will this give them access to, and how are you going to note the changes in their transaction volume and profitability, what have you, as a result of this new access? Yeah, sure, why not?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Debbie, for being on the call today and providing such amazing insight and perspective. And I'm really hopeful that everybody was able to take away something and be able to incorporate some of these topics and conversations into their proposals. Really thank you for your time. And thank you everybody for hopping on the call today. One more quick plug. I believe USDA is still requesting reviewers for applications. And this is an important point I think that Debbie brought up earlier, is that the people, if there are more people in the seafood industry that are reading proposals that have seafood experts that are reading seafood proposals, there'll be a better understanding of these proposals. And so I encourage you guys, if you have the time, to apply to become a reviewer. It is a paid opportunity. I think like $700. I think it's going to be a 4-week review period, and I think each
6 weeks, but not full time. But
I think they
condensed it? Okay.
yeah, because everything's been condensed.
Yeah.
It usually is 6, but I think this year it's 4. And
Okay. My information is 2 weeks old, so that's a lifetime. My government standards.
I know that's what I thought earlier too. But anywho, I encourage you guys to take part in that if you have any interest. And it's also a really good opportunity to understand how people are reviewing applications. And so if you apply this year or decide to apply next year, it's a really good experience to have to understand how applications are being graded. So thank you all so much for hopping on the call today. Please reach out if you have questions. And thank you again, Debbie. I'm going to go ahead and close us out. But thanks
Thank
all.
you. I really appreciate being here. Thank you guys. And
Thank
good
you.
luck to you all. All right. Bye-bye.
Debbie, do you want to stay on for a minute?